for being here today. It's such a treat. I feel like the artist talks we've had have been virtual, so it's such a treat to be here in person and have an audience and not be talking to a screen. I'm the Fellowship Director at Hamiltonian Artists and Curator. Hamiltonian Artists is a fellowship program where we offer professional development support, creative support, and community for D&D artists to advance their entrepreneurial success. Each year we accept 5 new fellows. This exhibition showcases our 2021 and 2022 fellows: Amber Eve Anderson, Jason Bullock, Maria Luz Bravo, Josie Enriquez, Stephanie Garon, Madeline Stratton, and Lionel Frazier Wright, who I want to congratulate today on their amazing exhibition. Lily, Executive Director at Hamiltonian Artists, has been doing some really important outreach in the area to share resources with institutions and find areas for collaboration, further challenging the contemporary art community and creating spaces for critical conversation. We're so lucky that through these efforts, we've gained new friendship and support with the Kreeger Museum. I want to say thank you to Helen, Ivan, Natalie, Anna, Joanna for their collaboration and generosity as we work together to present the Kreeger collection alongside the work of Hamiltonian artists in new and meaningful ways. The collaborative initiative spearheaded by the Kreeger Museum allows the permanent collection to take on new meaning as living artists are juxtaposed, offering modern approaches, reflecting the influences of our current society, humanity, implying the use of new technologies. In this show, I really appreciate the way the artists are centered. They are given an environment to realize the relationship with older works, the way concepts, techniques, and focus have shifted. More importantly, the show showcases their addition to the fine art timeline as contemporary artists with intersectional perspectives and diverse practices. In preparation for the show, I was inspired by a story Helen told during our first meeting visiting the Kreeger space. The first exhibition presented when the house opened to the public as a museum in 1998 was the work of Sam Gilliam. The artist was installing a sculpture on the terrace, then it was swept away by the wind and landed in the pool and sunk progressively into the water. In response to this, I was thinking of unexpected occurrences that happened in a museum space, an exhibition, a home, as inspiration to highlight other disturbances, surprises, and new discoveries. And in this case, the new discoveries between old and new work, which is why we chose the specific works to be in conversation with the permanent collection. And you can read more about this in the catalog, and I will stop talking for a bit and let the fellows introduce themselves. And then they'll ask each other questions.
Good afternoon, my name is Jason Bullock. My practice is a conceptual sculptural practice, and I explore a lot of materials in the interest of ideas.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Garon. I am an environmental artist, and I focus on humanity's interruption of nature. My work carries themes about claim, about labor, and also permanence.
How are you all? My name is Lionel Fraser Wright III. I'm a interdisciplinary conceptual artist. My practice is based in collage, installation, and video. I work focused on gentrification, displacement, erasure, and reinsertion, but also the enduring legacies of physical objects and the people that they reflect.
Hi, I'm Madeline Stratton. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, focusing primarily on memories of interior domestic spaces and the objects that occupy those spaces. In my practice, I work with a lot of different materials, primarily painting and sculpture, but most recently mixed media works as well.
Hi, I'm Amber Eve Anderson. I am a conceptual artist. I use a lot of materials like sculpture, found objects, images, installations, mostly based around concepts of home and place and like finding the way that your surroundings and experiences can influence your identity.
I'm going to start off with the first question and break the ice a little bit. I'm going to ask Madeline a question. Could you talk about your process creating work and then specifically the work for the show? So maybe just tell the audience a little bit more about your process.
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, I have an interest in memories of interior domestic spaces, how we remember spaces, and the sort of importance that we give to everyday objects that may have occupied those spaces. More recently, I've also kind of expanded that a little bit to think about sort of imagined spaces, playing more with material and with color that I use in my work. The work for this show, I was really inspired, obviously because I have an interest in architecture in my practice, the architecture of the museum and the fact that the building was previously a home. When we did our initial walkthrough, there were 2 of the Monet paintings that are up in the other room that just the colors really caught my eye, and I've been playing quite a bit with color recently. So I used photos I took of the space to help create the shapes of the paintings. So the paintings are cut out of wood, so they're not, traditional square or rectangle. And then the colors and the patterning come from those 2 Monet paintings.
Want to ask the next question?
Sure. I'll ask Jason. So in your practice, you use a lot of different materials. I think I've seen you do, video and photography and sculpture. So I'm curious how you chose the materials for the 2 pieces that are in this show.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So, I'll start off by saying my practice, I'm really interested in art as a space of discourse, right? And especially like a conversation that we've been having over, eons about how to make a world that's less oppressive, and that offers opportunities both for individuals and for especially marginalized groups to find space for expression. I'm especially interested in this room and the curating of this room, this relationship between these emerging abstractions and these traditions of abstraction that are from West Africa, this mask, this chihuahua, and just thinking about the relationship between object and audience and the kinds of decisions that artists are making, and it's like a material. So I was able to choose a wooden work that I think speaks to this relationship between modernism and African art especially. And then I have another work that takes up the use of genetic material, DNA especially, or specifically, and that's about this conversation between, specifically it comes from an article I read about Korean men's expression of oxytocin, which I just, this is an epigenetic study that I found really surprising, that it was in the recent literature, and just was looking for a way to respond in a way that wasn't too didactic, right? So abstraction, but that takes up this very material and maybe looks at this boundary again between artist and audience, through potentially a kind of abject material, right? DNA.
I'll follow up because I know you have your solo show up right now at Hamiltonian, so come and visit. So I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between the work in that show and the work here.
So this is more about discourse, right?
Yeah.
And this is more about this discourse of liberation. So one of the discourses I'm really interested in is the Mahayana Buddhist discourse. So that's like Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and you've got this 1,000-year old discourse around individual experiences of how do you relieve suffering, right? And I wonder, I'm constantly sort of wondering why more of this discourse isn't taken up in discourses of liberation in the West, whether that's about the kinds of liberation that art and science might offer us in the Western tradition, or the kinds of liberatory gestures that are made by folks in the West who are oppressed, right? So Black liberatory discourse. And so the work at Hamiltonian is now about sort of trying to provoke those kinds of conversations, both formally but also in the audience, the relationship between the audience and artist. My turn?
Yes.
Amber.
Yeah.
Holes in the digital sphere is brilliant, as chronicled in the post, and it really is. And I'm just wondering about this chronicling of like space interpretation in the digital sphere and which processes like how do you, and including the choice of material.
Yeah, so that piece, well, I consider myself like a late adopter of a smartphone. I didn't get a smartphone until I think 2014. And shortly after I moved to Morocco, so I was spending a lot of time there. After having just gotten this iPhone where I like had started using a lot of apps, and Google Maps being a map or an app that like I was using to find my way around Washington DC at the time a lot. Then I go to Morocco and maps, like Google Maps doesn't exist there, so there wasn't like this same like digital mapping of the city that I was living in, but they also have an app where you can like upload your own images. So a lot of individuals had used that app on their phone to upload different places where I was living. And so I was mostly just like thinking about the way that like these sorts of technologies can influence our behaviors. Like I'm no longer exploring these cities or just like having this mental image of a map in my mind or knowing the sequencing of streets or what have you, and I'm just like following this path, you know, that's dictated by this app. Anyway, when a user uploads an image but you don't take a photograph, like you don't take pictures of the sky right over your head, then it like creates this black hole. So the work is like just screenshots of me going through Google Maps in the city where I was living, Rabat, and taking screenshots on my phone of all of those holes, then printing them and arranging them from small to large, sort of referencing, that's why for the show, referencing this like an unexpected occurrence, but the work also is just this like unintended consequence of uploading this image to the digital sphere, you know? So yeah, that's the process. And then I liked the like handheld nature. I wanted to keep those screenshots sort of like small, but referencing, you know, grouping them in that way, referencing this more expansive, almost a horizon, you know, more all-encompassing type of experience. So, yeah. Yeah.
I know you have more questions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it sort of naturally segues into Stephanie's work and like its relationship to the environment. I mean, I specifically am curious about the experience of your piece in the garden versus your drawing in the basement, like the scale, and just could you talk more about that relationship?
Sure. My practice is based on the materials, and in that way I align myself with the Art Provera movement, or Li Yufan, where I'm presenting these materials and not necessarily serving as an activist or an advocate, but presenting them to you, the viewers, to incite discourse, right? To incite this dialogue. And so a year ago, I was invited up to Maine to work with 20,000 extracted mine cores, rock cores. The rock cores came from a mine that first was tapped about 100 years ago, then was tapped about 20 years ago, and about a year ago, a third mining company was coming in to try and extract from the land. This land is not only through oral tradition, but through written history, documented as tribal land, as Passamaquoddy land. There are 2 reservations literally within 5 miles of the mine. And so it became, from the beginning, I was ecstatic, right? Because of the matching with my own themes of investigation, my work between what I mentioned, claim and labor and permanence. And here I had that evidence of that in this rock, in this very funny looking rock, right? Because it was this very fine, cut with a diamond drill bit cylinder. Rocks aren't supposed to be in that fine shape, right? And so I jumped in and I did a lot of research. I started talking to earth scientists, to geologists. I started talking to chemists. I started talking to the tribal members. I started talking to the clammers, local people who live up in Maine, to all get their perspective on use of the land, on use of the mine, of these mine cores. And then I brought them back. I brought them back to my studio, which right now is based out of Baltimore. And I, again, have been doing this research and trying to make the connection here, right, to this land. And it came down to a number. It came down to, in our area, between here and Baltimore, there are 324 mines, active mines. Some of you might have, if you've gone within, I think it's like 5 miles away to Great Falls, you can still see the debris from the housing of the miners. It's, this was the heart of the gold rush, right here. And so what I did was I was working with that material, working with these cores, and I put them, because it was this kind of community, this assembly of them, and I put them in a circle. I put that on paper and then traced it, each one of them, and then removed them. That references a piece downstairs, right there. So you'll see there are 324 tracings of those mine cores. The heart of that piece ties to the heart of the outdoor piece, which is not necessarily what you see, but the absence of it. And so in that sense, what ties them both is, by their title, void. So what is humanity's interruption of nature? And how do you see it? How do you navigate yourself around it? And what perspectives do you bring? I gotta write that down for another statement.
We got it on.
Excellent. Yeah. I'm excited. I'm really excited about it. And if I can note, and maybe this will help segue, I love to segue to Nell's work too. Your question was so valid to me, Amber, because it was talking about what you see here is kind of this split, right, between how we would categorize a 2D work versus an outdoor sculptural 3D piece in the round. And where this has taken me is I've started a Works on Paper series just over the past 6 weeks. And this Works on Paper takes the ground mine core, right, these brown rocks, and I've made essentially paint pigment out of it. And so I've started creating these paintings which juxtapose the actual rock, which is bound to the paper by tree sap, and also chemicals used in mining. So for kind of the first time, I feel like I'm communicating, I'm articulating things on paper that make it aligns with the issues with this mining project. So you get to see it's that color, the color difference, the bleaching of the rock is kind of this evidence, right? This evidence of humanity's interruption. So yeah, so I'm excited. So that said, one of the things that I know, just we speak the same language, Nell and I, in terms of this passion with materials and attachment to them. And your piece downstairs, every time I've come here, stops me in my tracks, because I'm so drawn to each material and the selection and the juxtaposition of them and how you angle things. And so I'm curious, I've never had this conversation, right? How do you source your materials? And if you feel comfortable, if you're able to share maybe some of your own personal connections to them.
Well, I think some of the materials I sourced, I was like in Occurrence at the college I was going to. So the school was being renovated, and of course it was like an historic building, so like it was corporate. And so they were like remodeling the school, and I never thought I would go dumpster diving. I never thought. My mom would kill me if she found out. But I saw people going into the dumpster. I'm not going in there. Then I was like seeing stuff they were pulling out, and I was like, I'm going in there. So some of the stuff that I like started to collect was like from there. So I sourced a bunch of wood. So like sometimes I have to shoot the work because I find myself like cannibalizing some of the pieces and like remaking new configurations with the work. And of course the courtroom building, the courtroom himself was like, this is just the context behind the courtroom. He was not on the side of the union. And so that, gives that wood a particular kind of like history and context, particularly being a black student that went to, all that. And so like, that's the context of the material. And so it was a question of like, how much do I lean into that context? What is the material there? What is the metaphor that I'm trying to articulate with the material? But my own personal attachment is every single one of those bottles is mine. So I've partaken in all the bottles that are down there. So there's some Martell, what else? I think it's a lot of Martell. I was heavy on the brown for a second. But then like the candles, and so I was just thinking about like, starting to think about like altars, starting to think about like memory, starting to think about like how do we hold memory. So that was a lot of it. Then I would think about like dad passing away, passing on, like, and so I was thinking about those things. But also like it's a like there's even like the celebratory aspects of like how to do that. So like the candles, visuals, and like also being like some of the wood is actually not old wood. Some of the wood is like newer wood. And so sometimes like I feel like I'll make this short. But like when you have like wood and black stuff, it's like, oh, you're talking about like Reconstruction. I'm like, no, I'm talking about yesterday. Like yesterday, like I'm talking about like a year ago, and like how the context of like the environment impacts like the history and context of that wood. And so then thinking about the wood as people and bodies and how the body kind of reflects how wood holds memory and holds history. Then I'm like, well, then it's like a perfect kind of altar. This is a perfect place to have libations and have candles. That's it. That's kind of what I feel like.
Thank you. Yeah, I get all that.
I have a follow-up question for you. I feel like when we installed your piece downstairs, we had this moment with your work and the African Mass as they both speak to ritual and celebration. Can you talk more about that focus in your work and how?
I mean, one of my like big inspirations is like Jack Whitney. And it's like when you try to run from goats, they kind of like catch up to you. So like when we had this exhibition, I was like, no, I can't see it. I can't see it. But I'm gonna steal something. So I gotta wait. But then I finally kind of like saw the work and like the kind of like legacy of like using materials, using natural materials. And so like, just that kind of like being able to have my work. And even the concept of libations, like I can't think about that and not think about like African legacies and how Africans actually like their ceremonies. Am I an expert on it? No. But I know the connection is there. And so it was kind of like, oh, snap. I'm like, and even like I think contemporary black artists, there's this idea that contemporary black artists exist outside of the legacy of like African practices, African traditions, Southern traditions. And so even as we like explore new mediums and new concepts, like that legacy of African traditions, practices, still there, still informing how we move throughout our practices. And so it was just like to have that right next to the African works and then reflecting on like the practice of abstraction period, how abstraction has been informed by that legacy of, the African traditions.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
I had a question for Jason, and the question that I had was, I know you do like a lot of data collection in your practice and a lot of like archival like data collection. And so I was wondering, but then you also like make this flip where like the data collection becomes very intimate and like personal. And so I just saw that like that happen. I just wanted to how do you navigate that, or how do you like figure that into the work? How do you make that leap from like the data to like the kind of like lived experience of the people who like you know?
Sure. I mean, I have been really interested in like data collection, especially like databases. It's like metaphor, the way like the museum database describes the museum, but it also like has all these like other discrete like piles of data, like the paintings or the sculptures and people that come put all together that makes a museum. Right? So I was really interested in that metaphor. And I think as I've been working, I've just been sort of intuitively like developing this relationship with like materials and like the forms that I've been making. So I'm like discovering myself. This is the more intimate sort of relationship with this data collection.
I was wondering from you all the connections that you made with the permanent collection and your work, and things that you saw and things that made you think about the permanent collection in a different way, or maybe your work in a different way. So I was curious if any of you have any experiences like that from the show.
And I think definitely, and I think it was such a cool experience. At least for me, I don't want to speak for the other artists, but I know from just like other conversations we've had individually to have a chance to make work or think about recontextualizing some of our previous work in the context of the collection and the space as well. I think it's kind of both. The fact that there are Monet paintings right out there, or I think about Joey's work on paper that's across from the Bullock drawing, and that Paul Klee work on paper as well. I think it's really exciting, and it was. I know for me, my pieces are in the show I made specifically for the show, and again, from your question earlier, really based the shapes, especially on the architecture of the space. And I can talk about this more when we go around, but for example, one of the pieces, the shape is actually taken from being in this room and looking out onto the terrace. And this room, Helen told me, was where the Monet paintings used to hang when this served as a dining room for the Kreeger family. So kind of making some of those connections for me was fun and a good challenge, I think, too, as well as an artist. I think, I know I enjoy when there's some sort of good challenge there, I think. Well, that kind of has sort of a question I had for Amber,
Okay.
if that's okay too, that your piece bed that's in the library, I think that's such a beautiful setting for that video, and I'm curious how you feel about that setting, and if you think that it changes the sort of interpretation that the viewer could have of that piece. Because I'm imagining, that if it were just on the wall of a white gallery space, I think it would read very differently than, being on a video in the middle of all these books. So that sort of action of you turning, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we first did the site visit, that connection didn't even occur to me. So once Tomora curated the show and said that that's where it was gonna go, I was like, oh yeah, kind of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really interesting because as an artist, or again, don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm usually planning or thinking of my work in this white cube or black box, very blank slate, quote unquote. So I think, and then this museum, just the collection is so classic. When you think of museum collections and especially looking around this room, and have your Monets, you have your Picasso. And so, and then also the fact that it like was a home, I don't know, it's so layered that it is a really interesting museum to exhibit in. And yeah, I love it does, I think it lends all of the work more intimacy, and it's not so like stark and cold, and it's more, I don't know, it feels more like wrapped into your daily life in a way. I don't know if anyone else.
I agree. I think that it brings life to the collection, and you can like hear these conversations happening across the work. So I definitely think the word cold, like you said, came to me because you are literally living artists bringing life to, collection or these classic works that we all know well and have studied, and but how do we continue to talk about the work? How do we bring in the references from that work to now? So I think that's definitely a goal for this exhibition.
I mean, I was kind of stoked because of the show that we came like on the heels of with Sam Gilliam. And I was like, it's one of the first like artist visits I ever did was one of our high school professors, Stan Sparrow. He took us to Sam Gilliam's studio. And I was like, oh, you looking like this? Like, okay, I can do this. So it was just quite interesting. And then to have, Lou Stovall's studio, but then to have Sam Gilliam's work.
Yeah.
And so knowing like the way that those artists were in conversation with one another, and so like like people like Michael Platt, like those kind of like artists. And so like I got work in the same like, oh my god, like like a certain box has been checked now. It was kind of like.
But it felt very like surreal when we were installing, I think too. Just to say, like our work is literally next to these other artists. And then, like downstairs right after the Lou Stovall show, I felt it was like very surreal. Exciting.
For my outdoor piece, I was ecstatic to have the space, again, to have that opportunity and to be surrounded out there by, such traditional pieces and formal pieces. And I think because of that, there is this exchange, this conversation between my piece, which is in some ways very organic comparatively, right? Very, in some ways fragile and much more interactive with the environment. As it's been here, you can see, and this is one of the reasons why I worked with geologists, that as it gets exposed to more air, to more rain, that the actual colors of the core change. And so it's changed even in the past month or so. But you see a difference in kind of this emergence of the cores as opposed to placing of sculpture on a piece of land. So I really appreciated that exchange.
I have another question about your process for creating that sculptural piece, because I watched you.
Yes, you did.
I watched the labor and the digging and the placement, and I was in awe of you. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the immersion of your body, or you using your body as a part of your art practice.
I'm laughing because it's a very fair question, because you were the one person that was there and really happened there, throughout. So it's fair. It's a fair question. My work has been called kind of poetic and spiritual, and I believe that is because it is how I articulate my voice. And so part of my challenge and part of my objective in this Mindcore project is to again really let the materials speak for themselves. And so part of that for me means not just, again, throwing a sculpture down, but kind of connecting to the land. And so I, again, had kind of researched the land, researched this space, which mimics every space, which certainly mimics the environment up in Maine in terms of, this is tribal land. We are connected, we all need water, we need this soil, and so it became, as many drawings as I did, and as many different kind of setups that I did in my studio beforehand, it became really important to me to actually feel, to be tactile and feel that soil. Of course, it was like a 300-degree day that day. So I'm not saying it was pretty or necessarily pretty to watch, but I think the other part of it is doing my own labor. So, where some other artists, other environmental artists might pull in a team of interns or a team of people. It's very, very important to me. This is my artwork. This is my own connection to the land, to literally use my own hands. Yeah.
It was very meditative watching. I can tell that you were in like this spiritual realm. There were sprinklers going up and down your head, and I couldn't even stop you at all. So I was like, he's definitely like in this space. So I just want you to know that it was just as interesting as the work itself to watch you like almost at the performance. It was really
A
great.
lot of movement.
Yeah, it was.